The snow fell in relentless sheets, blanketing the world in an endless expanse of white. Captain Rowan stood at the edge of the base camp, his eyes narrowed against the biting wind. He was a man forged by the wilderness, his face weathered and his gaze as sharp as the ice that surrounded them. The storm was coming, and with it, a deadly challenge that would test the limits of his team's resilience. Rowan turned to face his crew, a hand-picked group of elite rescuers. They were the best of the best, each one hardened by countless missions in the most unforgiving terrains. But this mission was different. Somewhere out there, a group of hikers were stranded, their lives hanging in the balance as the blizzard approached. "Listen up," Rowan barked, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "We've got a group of civilians out there, and it's our job to bring them back alive. The storm's coming fast, so we don't have much time. Gear up and be ready to move out in 10. As the team scrambled to prepare, Rowan's mind raced with the challenges ahead. He knew that the blizzard would be their greatest adversary, a relentless force of nature that could swallow them whole. But he also knew that his team was the best chance those hikers had of making it out alive. With a final check of their equipment, Rowan led his team out into the frozen wilderness. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they trudged forward, the wind whipping at their faces with icy tendrils. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing hikers. As they pressed deeper into the mountains, the storm intensified. The snow fell thicker, obscuring their vision and slowing their progress. Rowan gritted his teeth, his determination unwavering. He had faced worse than this before, and he would not let the blizzard defeat him. But even as he pushed forward, a sense of unease crept into his mind. Something was different about this mission, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was as if the very wilderness itself was conspiring against them, throwing every obstacle in their path. Little did Rowan know that the greatest challenge of his life lay just ahead, waiting in the frozen depths of the mountains. A force of nature unlike any he had ever encountered, one that would test not only his physical strength but the very core of his beliefs. The team trudged through the deep snow, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they pushed themselves to the limit. Rowan led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing hikers. The storm was intensifying with each passing minute, the wind howling like a wounded animal as it tore at their exposed skin. Suddenly, Rowan held up a hand, signaling for the team to stop. There, in the distance, was a sight that made his blood run cold. An enormous bear, its fur matted with snow and ice, stood directly in their path. Its eyes glinted with a primal intelligence, and Rowan knew immediately that this was no ordinary animal. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. "That thing's a danger to us all." But even as he spoke, the bear began to move. It lumbered forward, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Rowan's hand tightened on his rifle, ready to take the shot if necessary. But to his surprise, the bear stopped just short of them, its gaze fixed on Rowan with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "What's it doing?" whispered Ethan, the team's youngest member. "It's like it's trying to tell us something." Rowan scoffed at the idea. "Bears don't tell us anything," he growled. "They're wild animals, and they'll kill us given half a chance." But even as he spoke, the bear turned and began to walk away, its steps deliberate and purposeful. Rowan hesitated, his instincts warring with his training. Every fiber of his being told him to eliminate the threat, to put a bullet between the bear's eyes and be done with it. But something else, some deeper intuition, held him back. "We follow it," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "But keep your guard up. If that thing so much as twitches in our direction, we take it down." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew better than to question Rowan's orders. They fell into line behind him, their eyes fixed on the retreating form of the bear as it led them deeper into the frozen wilderness. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was more than just an animal. There was something almost human in its eyes, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere instinct. He glanced at Mara, the team's local guide, and saw the same question reflected in her gaze. But there was no time for doubts or second guesses. The storm was closing in, and with each passing minute, their chances of survival grew slimmer. They had no choice but to trust in Rowan's leadership and the strange, silent guide that walked ahead of them into the unknown. The bear led them deeper into the mountains, its path winding through narrow crevasses and over treacherous ice fields. The storm raged around them, the wind screaming like a banshee as it tore at their clothing and exposed skin. Rowan pushed forward, his jaw set with grim determination. He had never backed down from a challenge before, and he wasn't about to start now. But as the hours stretched on, the team's resolve began to waver. Their equipment was failing, the cold seeping into their bones like a relentless enemy. Ethan stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him as exhaustion and hypothermia took their toll. Mara was at his side in an instant, her strong hands pulling him back to his feet. "We can't keep going like this," she said, her voice strained with worry. "We need to find shelter, or we're not going to make it." Rowan shook his head, his eyes fixed on the bear's retreating form. "We keep moving," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "That bear's leading us somewhere, and we're going to follow it until we find those hikers." But even as he spoke, a crack like thunder split the air. The team watched in horror as the ice bridge ahead of them gave way, crumbling into the abyss below. Rowan cursed under his breath, his mind racing as he tried to find another way forward. It was then that the bear stopped, its massive head turning to regard them with an almost human expression. It gave a low, rumbling growl, and then turned and began to walk in a different direction, away from the collapsed bridge and towards a narrow canyon that they had not seen before. Rowan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he knew that they had no choice. The storm was only getting worse, and they needed to find shelter before it was too late. With a grunt of frustration, he motioned for the team to follow him as he set off after the bear once more. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the frozen landscape for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the endless expanse of white and the howling of the wind. Mara noticed his unease and placed a hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low and concerned. Ethan shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over him. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but something doesn't feel right. It's like the bear is leading us into a trap." Mara's eyes narrowed, and she glanced ahead to where Rowan was trudging through the snow, his back straight and his shoulders set with determination. "Rowan knows what he's doing," she said, her voice firm. "We have to trust him." But even as she spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. They were in uncharted territory now, following a wild animal deeper into the heart of the storm. And with each passing minute, the stakes grew higher, and the price of failure more devastating. The canyon was narrow and treacherous, the walls of ice rising up on either side like the jaws of some great beast. The bear led them deeper into the frozen labyrinth, its steps sure and purposeful even as the storm raged around them. Rowan followed close behind, his rifle at the ready and his eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. As they pressed on, the team's supplies began to dwindle. They had packed for a short rescue mission, not a prolonged trek through the wilderness. Rowan rationed their food and water carefully, but he knew that they were running out of time. If they didn't find the hikers soon, they would be forced to turn back or risk starvation. Ethan stumbled again, his legs giving out beneath him as the cold and exhaustion took their toll. Mara was at his side in an instant, her strong arms pulling him back to his feet. But as she did, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Ethan's fingers were turning white, the first signs of frostbite setting in. "Rowan," she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to stop. Ethan's in trouble." Rowan turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Ethan's pale, shivering form. He knew that Mara was right, that they needed to find shelter and warmth before it was too late. But the bear was still moving, its pace unrelenting as it led them deeper into the canyon. For a moment, Rowan was torn. Every instinct in his body told him to keep pushing forward, to follow the bear until they found the hikers. But he knew that he couldn't risk the lives of his team, not even for the sake of the mission. With a grunt of frustration, he called for a halt. The team huddled together, their breath clouding the air as they tried to conserve their warmth. Rowan dug through his pack, pulling out a small stove and a can of fuel. It was a risk, he knew, to start a fire in such close quarters. But they needed the heat, and they needed it now. As the flames flickered to life, Rowan's mind raced with the possibilities. He knew that they couldn't stay here for long, that the storm would only get worse as the day wore on. But he also knew that they couldn't go back, not without the hikers. He glanced at the bear, its massive form still visible through the swirling snow. It was waiting for them, he realized, its eyes fixed on the team with an almost human intelligence. And in that moment, Rowan knew that he had to trust it, had to follow it to the end, no matter the cost. "We rest for an hour," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Then we keep moving. The bear knows the way, and we're going to follow it until we find those hikers." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew better than to argue with Rowan. They huddled closer to the fire, their hands and faces tingling as the warmth slowly crept back into their bodies. And as they rested, the bear watched over them, its gaze never wavering, its purpose never forgotten. The hour passed all too quickly, and soon the team was on the move once more. The bear led them out of the canyon and onto a narrow ridge, the wind howling around them like a pack of hungry wolves. Rowan pushed forward, his jaw set with grim determination. He knew that they were running out of time, that the storm was only getting worse with each passing minute. As they walked, Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities. He had heard stories of animals leading lost hikers to safety, of wild creatures possessing a wisdom that humans could only dream of. But he had always dismissed them as mere folklore, the stuff of campfire tales and old wives' tales. Now, as he watched the bear's massive form moving ahead of them through the swirling snow, he began to wonder if there might be some truth to those stories after all. The bear seemed to know exactly where it was going, its steps sure and purposeful even as the storm raged around them. Mara noticed his thoughtful expression and fell into step beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice low and curious. Ethan shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm thinking that maybe there's more to this bear than meets the eye," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Maybe it's not just a wild animal, but something more." Mara's eyes widened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze. But before he could ask her about it, Rowan's voice cut through the air like a knife. "There," he shouted, his arm pointing to a distant peak. "I see something." The team squinted through the swirling snow, their eyes straining to make out the shape that Rowan had spotted. And then they saw it. A small, dark form huddled against the mountainside. "It's them!" Mara cried, her voice filled with relief and excitement. "The hikers!" Rowan nodded, his face set with determination. "Let's move," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "We're getting them out of here no matter what it takes." The team surged forward, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of their newfound purpose. The bear led the way, its massive form breaking a path through the deep snow. And as they drew closer to the hikers, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, something that defied all logic and reason. But there was no time for wonder or speculation. The hikers were in trouble, their lives hanging in the balance. And it was up to Rowan and his team to bring them back from the brink, to snatch them from the jaws of death itself. As they approached the huddled forms, Rowan's heart began to pound in his chest. He knew that the next few minutes would be critical, that every second counted in the race against the storm. And as he reached for his radio, ready to call in the rescue choppers, he knew that he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The hikers were in bad shape, their faces pale and their limbs stiff with cold. Rowan and his team worked quickly, wrapping them in thermal blankets and giving them warm drinks from their thermoses. But even as they worked, the storm continued to rage around them, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Rowan knew that they needed to get the hikers to safety and fast. But the bear was still there, its massive form looming over them like a silent guardian. And as he watched it, Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell them something, that it had a plan of its own. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The choppers can't land in this storm, and we can't stay here much longer." The team nodded, their faces grim with determination. They knew that they were in a race against time, that every second counted in the battle against the elements. But as they prepared to move out, the bear suddenly turned and began to walk away, its steps deliberate and purposeful. Rowan hesitated, his instincts warring with his training. Every fiber of his being told him to ignore the animal, to focus on the task at hand and get the hikers to safety. But something else, some deeper intuition, held him back. He glanced at Mara, saw the same question reflected in her eyes. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "We follow the bear," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's gotten us this far, and I have a feeling it knows the way out of here." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew better than to question Rowan's orders. They fell into line behind him, the hikers supported between them as they set off into the swirling snow once more. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the frozen landscape for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the endless expanse of white and the howling of the wind. Mara noticed his unease and placed a hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low and concerned. Ethan shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over him. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "But something doesn't feel right. It's like we're being led into a trap." Mara's eyes narrowed, and she glanced ahead to where Rowan was trudging through the snow, his back straight and his shoulders set with determination. "We have to trust him," she said, her voice firm. "And we have to trust the bear. It's our only chance." But even as she spoke, a sudden gust of wind slammed into them, knocking them off balance and sending them tumbling into the deep snow. Rowan cursed, struggling to his feet as he tried to regain his bearings. And then he saw it, a sight that made his blood run cold. The bear was gone, vanished into the swirling snow as if it had never been there at all. "You're right. Let me provide a properly expanded 2,200-word version directly in our chat." Rowan felt a sense of dread wash over him as he realized the bear had disappeared. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a banshee, and the team was left to fend for themselves in the unforgiving wilderness. He knew they had to keep moving, to push forward and find a way out. But without the bear's guidance, he felt lost and uncertain. The hikers were barely conscious, their bodies weakened by the cold and exhaustion. Rowan and his team had to support them, half carrying them through the deep snow as they searched for shelter. Every step was a struggle, every breath a battle against the biting wind. As they trudged onwards, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the horizon, his eyes straining to see through the swirling snow, but there was no sign of the bear or any other living creature. It was as if they were alone in a frozen wasteland, abandoned by the very thing that had brought them this far. Mara, sensing Ethan's unease, moved closer to him, her voice low and reassuring. "We can't give up now," she said, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "We've come too far to turn back." Rowan nodded, his jaw set with determination. He knew Mara was right. They had to keep going, to push themselves to the limit and beyond. But as the hours stretched on and the storm showed no sign of abating, he began to feel a creeping sense of despair. They were lost, adrift in a sea of white, with no idea which way to turn. The bear had been their guide, their one hope of survival, and now it was gone. Just as he was about to give the order to stop and make camp, he saw something that made his heart leap with hope. There, in the distance, was a flicker of light, a tiny pinprick of warmth in the vast expanse of white. "There," he shouted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I see something." The team squinted through the swirling snow and saw it. A small cabin nestled against the mountainside, its windows lit with a welcoming orange glow. The cabin was small and rustic, but to the exhausted team, it was heaven sent. They stumbled inside, their bodies aching with fatigue and cold, and collapsed onto the rough-hewn benches that lined the walls. Rowan quickly took charge, assigning tasks to make the most of their temporary shelter. They needed to get a fire going, warm themselves, and tend to the hikers. As the team set to work, Mara pulled Rowan aside, her eyes filled with concern. "We can't stay here for long," she said, her voice urgent. "The storm's only going to get worse, and we're still a long way from help." Rowan knew she was right, but looking at his exhausted team and the rescued hikers, he knew they were in no condition to travel. They would stay for the night, taking turns keeping watch. The team huddled together for warmth, sharing stories in low voices to keep their spirits up. Ethan sat quietly in a corner, his mind whirling with thoughts of the bear and their inexplicable bond. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just an animal, that it had possessed some deeper wisdom, some hidden purpose. Morning came with a brief respite from the storm, but they found themselves trapped by deep snow drifts against the cabin walls. The path they had taken was completely buried. Ethan spoke up, his voice filled with strange certainty. "We have to follow the bear," he said, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "It brought us this far, and it will lead us out again." Rowan was skeptical, but Mara stepped forward in support. "Ethan's right," she said, her voice strong and clear. "The bear is still with us, even if we can't see it. We have to trust in its wisdom, in the path it set for us." Despite his doubts, something deeper told Rowan they were right. They set out, following the faint tracks left by the bear through the deep snow. The path seemed to defy logic, winding and circuitous, but as they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided. Then they saw it, a narrow pass, barely visible through the swirling snow, leading down into a sheltered valley below. It was a route they never would have found on their own. The valley was a sanctuary, the snow shallower and the wind less biting. As they made their way down, Rowan caught a glimpse of dark fur and shining eyes disappearing into a distant copse of trees. The bear was still with them, watching over them from afar. He felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, and humility that brought tears to his eyes. He had always prided himself on his self-reliance, but now he realized how small he truly was in the face of nature's power. They made camp in the valley, tending to the hikers who were weak but alive. The team had faced impossible odds, pushing themselves beyond their limits, yet never losing sight of their mission or their compassion. As the storm clouds began to clear, Rowan knew they had to keep moving, but he also knew they would never be the same. The experience had changed them all in profound ways. Their salvation came in the form of a rescue helicopter, its rotors cutting through the crisp mountain air. As they huddled together waiting for rescue, faces etched with exhaustion and triumph, Rowan felt both relief and sadness. They had done the impossible, bringing the hikers back from the brink of death, but leaving behind something profound in that frozen wilderness. "Do you think we'll ever see the bear again?" Ethan asked Mara as they prepared to board the helicopter. "We may not see it with our eyes," she replied softly, "but it will always be with us, in our hearts and memories. It's a part of us now, just as we are a part of it." Back at base camp, they were celebrated as heroes, but Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The debriefings and medical checks blurred together as he found himself thinking of the bear and their inexplicable bond. The creature had shown him the power of instinct, the importance of trusting in something greater than himself. As weeks turned into months, Rowan felt drawn back to the mountains, back to the place where he had faced his greatest challenge and learned his most important lesson. The bear had vanished into the wild, never to be seen again, but its impact remained. It had taught them all that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from human knowledge or training, but from trusting in the ancient, mysterious ways of the wilderness itself. They had followed the bear's guidance, trusted in the wisdom of the wild, and it had brought them home. In doing so, they had discovered something far more valuable than mere survival. They had found a deeper connection to the natural world and to each other, a bond that would remain unbroken through all the years to come. The experience had transformed them all, especially Rowan. He had entered those mountains as a man who believed in control and self-reliance above all else. He emerged with a profound respect for the mysteries of the wild, and the understanding that true strength often lies in knowing when to surrender to forces greater than ourselves. The bear had given them more than just guidance. It had given them a new way of seeing the world and their place within it. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Rowan found himself returning to the mountains more frequently. Each time he went back, he looked for signs of the bear, though he knew deep down he would never see it again. These trips weren't just about searching for the mysterious creature. They were about maintaining the connection he had found with the wilderness during those harrowing days. The experience had changed his approach to rescue missions entirely. Where once he had relied solely on maps, equipment, and protocols, he now taught his teams to read the subtle signs of the wilderness. The way the wind changed direction, how the animals behaved before a storm, the hidden paths that only revealed themselves when you stopped trying to force your way through. Mara had stayed with the team, but Ethan had moved on, taking a position as a wilderness guide in another part of the country. Before he left, he had confided in Rowan that he couldn't look at the mountains the same way anymore. "It's like the bear showed us a different world," he had said, "one that was always there, but we were too blind to see it." The rescued hikers had all recovered, though their story had taken on an almost mythical quality among the local climbing community. Some dismissed their tales of the mysterious bear as hallucinations brought on by cold and exhaustion. Others, particularly those who had spent their lives in these mountains, listened with knowing looks and shared their own stories of inexplicable encounters in the wilderness. On the anniversary of their rescue, Rowan organized a small gathering at the base camp. Mara came, of course, and Ethan made the journey back. Even two of the hikers they had rescued attended. They sat around a fire as the sun set behind the peaks, sharing memories of those intense days. "I've been thinking," Mara said during a lull in the conversation, "about why the bear chose to help us. Why it appeared when it did, and why it left when it did." She paused, watching the flames dance. Maybe it wasn't about saving just those hikers. Maybe it was about teaching us something larger about our relationship with these mountains. Rowan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The bear had shown them that the wilderness wasn't simply an obstacle to be overcome or a challenge to be conquered. It was a living thing with its own wisdom and ways of knowing. Sometimes, survival meant learning to move with it rather than against it. As the fire died down and the stars emerged in the crystal-clear mountain sky, Rowan felt a deep sense of peace. The bear had led them through the storm, but more importantly, it had led them to a deeper understanding of themselves and their place in the natural world. That was its true gift, not just survival but transformation. And somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire, in the vast wilderness that stretched out beneath the stars, Rowan knew the bear was still there, still watching, still guiding those who were willing to trust in the ancient wisdom of the wild. Its legacy lived on in every rescue mission, every decision, every moment when they chose to listen to the voice of the wilderness instead of imposing their will upon it. That was the bear's final lesson, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but simply accepted, honored, and passed on to those who would come after. And in that acceptance, they had found something far more valuable than any certainty could provide. They had found their way home, not just to safety, but to a deeper truth about what it meant to be part of the wild world. End of the story.